He thought I needed help finding a decent job. They thought I was just another family failure living off Daddy's money. But right there on the golf course, when one click brought my face straight onto CNBC, the truth exploded, and the price of humiliating me in front of everyone he was about to pay it in full. My name is Rachel Monroe, and for 36 years, I've been my father's greatest disappointment. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Growing up in Cleveland's elite circles, where Richard Monroe's law practice commanded respect and his golf handicap earned admiration, I thought I'd eventually find my place in his carefully curated world. Instead, every achievement I brought home was met with a measured nod. Every dream I shared was dissected for its impracticalities, and every stumble was cataloged as evidence of my fundamental inadequacy. "Rachel's still figuring things out," became his favorite phrase when introducing me to colleagues at the country club. At 16, it stung. At 26, it infuriated me. At 36, sitting in the kitchen of my childhood home at 7:30 in the morning, watching him prep for another round of golf with his usual crew, it felt like a knife twisting in an old wound. "You should come today," he said, not looking up from his coffee. "The boys are always asking about you." The boys, Mr. Dalton, who owned half the steel mills in Ohio, Dr. Whitman, whose cardiac surgery waiting list stretched 6 months, Mr. Alvarez, whose real estate empire dotted the Cleveland skyline. These weren't casual golf buddies, they were titans who moved markets and shaped policies over 18 holes. "I'm sure they have better things to discuss than my employment status," I replied, the bitterness seeping through despite my best efforts. "That's exactly why you should come." His tone carried that familiar edge of paternal disappointment. "Networking, Rachel. These men have connections. They could help you find something. Substantial." Something substantial, as if my PhD in energy economics from MIT was a community college certificate, as if the patents filed under my name were participation trophies, as if the company I'd built from scratch was a lemonade stand. But he didn't know about Helios Energy Systems. How could he? When the last time I'd tried to share my entrepreneurial dreams, he'd laughed and suggested I get serious about a real career. That was 5 years ago, when my startup was just algorithms and ambition. Now it was contracts and capital, but the wound of his dismissal had never healed. "Fine," I heard myself saying. "I'll come." His eyebrows lifted slightly surprise, maybe even pleasure. For a moment, I almost regretted agreeing. Then I remembered the quarterly reports sitting in my briefcase upstairs, the ones showing revenue figures that would make his prestigious law practice look like pocket change, and my resolve hardened. Let him parade me around as his underachieving daughter one more time. Let his friends offer their patronizing advice about finding my path. Let them all assume I was another trust fund disappointment living off family wealth. Because today, for the first time in decades, I wouldn't be the one leaving that golf course humiliated. The irony wasn't lost on me as I headed upstairs to change clothes. I'd spent years trying to earn his respect through achievement, only to discover that the biggest achievement of my life would come from finally letting him reveal exactly who he'd always believed me to be. The Meadowbrook Country Club's pristine fairways stretched out like a green carpet of privilege, each blade of grass manicured to perfection. By 10:15, Dad's usual foursome had assembled at the first tee, their golf carts loaded with equipment that cost more than most people's cars. "Rachel," Mr. Dalton's booming voice carried across the practice green. "Richard said you'd be joining us today. What a pleasant surprise." The steel magnate's smile was warm but tinged with that particular brand of sympathy reserved for the wayward children of successful friends. "Dr." Whitman nodded politely, his surgeon's hands adjusting his glove with practiced precision. Mr. Alvarez, tanned from his latest acquisition trip to Miami, offered a firm handshake and an appraising look. "Gentlemen, you remember my daughter," Dad said, his tone carrying that familiar note of forced pride mixed with barely concealed embarrassment. "She's been exploring her options lately." There it was. Not 30 seconds in, and he'd already relegated me to the category of lost soul-seeking direction. Exploring options, Mr. Dalton repeated thoughtfully. Nothing wrong with that. The job market's tough these days, especially for young people trying to find their footing. Young people. I was 36 years old with more advanced degrees than anyone in this group, but here I was being discussed like a recent college graduate fumbling through entry-level interviews. Richard mentioned you have an impressive educational background, Dr. Whitman added kindly. MIT, wasn't it energy studies? Energy economics, I corrected softly. Ah, yes, economics. Mr. Alvarez jumped in. You know, my nephew graduated with an economics degree. Took him 2 years to find steady work, but he's doing well now in banking. Sometimes it just takes time to translate academic knowledge into practical application. I felt my jaw clench as they began their well-intentioned assault of career advice. Dad stood beside me, nodding along as if their words were pearls of wisdom I desperately needed to hear. The key is networking, Mr. Dalton continued as we walked toward the first tee. It's not what you know, it's who you know. Lucky for you, your father here has connections throughout Cleveland. Absolutely, Dad chimed in, eager to play the helpful parent. I've been telling Rachel she should leverage our family connections more. Sometimes pride gets in the way of practical decisions. Pride. He thought my reluctance to accept his help was pride, not the bone-deep knowledge that every favor would come with a lecture about responsibility and realistic expectations, not the memory of him telling my college roommates' parents that I was still trying to find myself while they bragged about their daughter's Wall Street internship. As we approached the first hole, the conversation seamlessly shifted to business ventures, market fluctuations, and policy changes that affected their various enterprises. I listened as Mr. Dalton discussed a new steel contract with the Department of Defense, as Dr. Whitman mentioned his hospital's expansion plans, as Mr. Alvarez detailed his latest commercial development project. These were serious men discussing serious money. Millions of dollars flowed through their conversations like casual observations about the weather. And through it all, Dad interjected with small comments about my situation. Rachel's been quite selective about opportunities, he explained when Mr. Alvarez mentioned knowing several company presidents who might be hiring. She's particular about finding the right fit. Selective, particular, code words for unemployed and picky. Smart approach, Dr. Whitman nodded approvingly. Better to wait for the right opportunity than jump into something unsuitable. What kind of position are you targeting? Rachel. The question hung in the air as all 4 men turned to look at me expectantly. Dad's expression was encouraging but cautious, as if he were afraid I might say something embarrassing about changing the world through renewable energy, a topic he'd once dismissed as idealistic nonsense. I'm interested in energy sector opportunities, I said carefully, particularly in renewable technologies and government contracts. Government work, Mr. Dalton mused. Stable, good benefits, might be a good fit while you build experience. Experience. As if I were a fresh graduate rather than someone who'd been working in energy policy since before some of their own children entered high school. The renewable sector's interesting, Mr. Alvarez added. Growing field, lots of federal investment these days. You might look into some of the larger consulting firms that handle government contracts. They're always looking for people with academic backgrounds to fill analyst positions. Analyst positions. Entry-level stepping stones for people who needed to prove themselves capable of handling real responsibility. I smiled and nodded, playing the role of grateful daughter receiving valuable guidance from successful family friends. Inside, a familiar fire burned, the same one that had driven me through late nights of coding, endless investor meetings, and the countless obstacles that stood between a woman with an idea and a billion-dollar industry ready to take her seriously. Let them finish their round of advice. Let Dad continue positioning me as his disappointing daughter who needed their help finding a suitable career path. Because somewhere in Manhattan, my company's stock ticker was climbing, and by the time we reached the 18th hole, one way or another, the truth would be impossible to ignore, while they debated whether I should start with something simple in renewable consulting, I thought about the conference call I'd had at 6 this morning with the Secretary of Energy. While Mr. Dalton explained how entry-level government positions could build my resume, I remembered signing the contract that would revolutionize America's power grid. While Dr. Whitman suggested I consider administrative roles to get my foot in the door, I mentally reviewed the patent portfolio that had taken me 5 years to develop and would take our competitors 20 to replicate. Helios Energy Systems wasn't just a company, it was the culmination of everything I'd learned about energy economics, everything I'd observed about market failures, and everything I'd dreamed about since my first economics course at MIT. While my classmates had rushed toward Wall Street and consulting firms, I'd seen something bigger, a fundamental transformation in how America would power itself for the next century. The irony was exquisite. Dad had no idea that his daughter, the one he introduced as still figuring things out, owned 17 patents in solar energy optimization. The same daughter he worried couldn't find steady employment had just closed a $4.8 billion contract with the federal government. The child he thought needed career guidance was literally reshaping energy policy at the highest levels of government. You know what Rachel should consider, Mr. Alvarez was saying as he lined up his putt. LinkedIn optimization. Most young people don't understand how to present themselves professionally online. LinkedIn. If only he knew that my profile was set to private precisely because I couldn't walk down a street in Silicon Valley without being recognized. If only he understood that keeping my professional life hidden wasn't about shame, it was about protecting the last shred of normal family relationship I had left. That's actually excellent advice. Dad jumped in enthusiastically. Rachel's always been modest about promoting herself, sometimes to a fault. Modest. The word stung because it was so perfectly wrong. I wasn't modest, I was exhausted. Exhausted from years of sharing my ambitions only to have them dissected and dismissed. Exhausted from bringing home achievements that were never quite impressive enough. Exhausted from existing in the space between who I actually was and who he needed me to be to fit his worldview. 5 years ago, when Helios was still just algorithms and theoretical models, I'd made the mistake of telling him about my plans. We'd been having dinner at this very country club, actually, celebrating his latest legal victory. Flush with wine and optimism, I'd shared my vision for transforming renewable energy infrastructure. "Sweetheart," he'd said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "It's wonderful that you're passionate about environmental issues, but maybe you should focus on getting some practical experience first. These Silicon Valley dreams, they're not for people like us." People like us, as if being his daughter automatically disqualified me from the kind of innovation that built empires. The renewable sector needs government relations specialists. Dr. Whitman was explaining now, apparently having appointed himself my career counselor. Someone with your academic background could probably find entry-level work with lobbying firms. Entry-level. The phrase had become a drumbeat following me around the golf course, as if the woman who'd testified before Congress about energy policy needed to start at the bottom of an industry she was actively reshaping. "Rachel's always been interested in making a difference," Dad added, his voice carrying that tone of parental indulgence reserved for children who chose impractical dreams over sensible careers. "Sometimes you have to channel that idealism into realistic opportunities." Channel idealism into realistic opportunities. The same man who'd built his legal career on high-stakes corporate litigation was advising his daughter to be realistic about changing the world. The truth was sitting in my phone, just a few taps away. Quarterly reports showing revenue growth that would make their established businesses look stagnant. Board meeting minutes documenting expansion plans across 12 states. Email threads with senators, governors, and department heads who sought my input on energy policy. But I'd learned something important over the years. The most devastating revelations aren't the ones you plan. They're the ones that unfold naturally, inevitably, like watching someone dig their own grave one shovelful at a time. "You know what might help," Mr. Dalton suggested as we approached the 7th hole. "Informational interviews. I could arrange for Rachel to meet with some executives in the energy consulting space. Nothing formal, Just coffee meetings to learn about different career paths. Coffee meetings to learn about career paths, with executives whose companies were probably licensing my technology. That's incredibly generous, Dad responded, his gratitude genuine and painful to watch. Rachel would appreciate any guidance these gentlemen could provide. Would appreciate guidance, as if I hadn't spent the last 3 months providing guidance to the federal government on restructuring America's energy independence strategy. I smiled and nodded, playing my assigned role while a different kind of energy built inside me, not the renewable kind I'd built my fortune on, but the raw, electric anticipation of someone who knew exactly how this story was going to end. Because at 11:45 this morning, CNBC was scheduled to announce the largest government renewable energy contract in American history. And when they did, every assumption, every piece of advice, every patronizing suggestion would crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. The only question was whether I'd feel satisfaction or sorrow when my father finally realized who his daughter actually was. The explosion came at 11:47. We were standing on the 9th tee when Mr. Alvarez's phone buzzed with a CNBC notification. He glanced at it absently while Dad continued explaining why I should consider starting small and building credibility in the energy sector. Mr. Alvarez muttered, squinting at his screen. Big energy news today. Oh, Dr. Whitman looked up from selecting his club. What kind of energy news? Some renewable company just landed a massive federal contract. $4.8 billion. He scrolled through the article. Biggest clean energy deal in U.S. history, apparently. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my expression neutral. This was it. The moment 5 years of secrecy would either vindicate me or destroy whatever relationship I had left with my father. Which company? Mr. Dalton asked, suddenly interested. His steel business had been losing contracts to more environmentally conscious competitors lately. Let me see. Mr. Alvarez squinted at the small text. Helios Energy Systems. Never heard of them. Must be one of those Silicon Valley startups that came out of nowhere. The silence that followed felt like the pause before thunder. I could feel my father's eyes on me, could sense the exact moment when the name registered. Helios, Dad repeated slowly. That's an unusual name. Very unusual, I agreed quietly. Mr. Alvarez was still reading, his voice taking on the tone of someone discovering something remarkable. Says here the CEO is some woman named... He paused, his eyes widening. Rachel Monroe. The golf club slipped from Dr. Whitman's hands and clattered onto the tee box. Rachel Monroe, Mr. Dalton repeated, his voice hollow with disbelief. 3 sets of eyes turned toward me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not pity, not patronizing concern, but something approaching awe mixed with complete bewilderment. That's impossible, Dad whispered. Is it? I asked softly. Mr. Alvarez held up his phone, the CNBC article clearly visible on the screen. There was my professional headshot, the one I'd had taken 6 months ago for the Forbes cover story that Dad had somehow missed, staring back at us from the bright display. Rachel Monroe, 36, founder and CEO of Helios Energy Systems, signs landmark $4.8 billion contract with the Department of Energy. Mr. Alvarez read aloud, his voice gaining strength with each word. The deal represents the largest federal investment in renewable energy infrastructure in American history. Dad's face had gone completely white. His golf glove hung loose on his hand, forgotten in the moment of recognition. Monroe, who holds a PhD in energy economics from MIT and 17 patents in solar optimization technology, founded Helios 5 years ago with the goal of revolutionizing America's power grid. Mr. Alvarez continued, unable to stop reading. The company's proprietary technology has been called transformational by industry experts and essential to America's energy independence by the Secretary of Energy. 17 patents, Dr. Whitman echoed faintly. $4.8 billion, Mr. Dalton added, his voice barely above a whisper. The golf course had never been so quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what would come next. Richard, Mr. Alvarez said slowly, looking from the phone to my father to me and back again. Did you know about this? Dad opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. No sound came out. The article mentions she's from Cleveland, Dr. Whitman said, still staring at me like I'd materialized from another dimension. Says she returned home recently to be closer to family while managing the company's Midwest expansion. Closer to family, Dad repeated, the words sounding strange in his mouth. There's more, Mr. Alvarez said, scrolling further. Monroe will be speaking at the World Economic Forum next month about the future of renewable energy policy. She currently serves on the President's Advisory Committee on Energy Innovation and was recently named to Time magazine's list of the world's most influential people under 40. Time magazine, the President's Advisory Committee, World Economic Forum. While they'd been discussing whether I should consider entry-level positions in renewable consulting, I'd been advising the President of the United States on energy policy. The irony was so complete, so perfect, that I almost laughed. I don't understand, Dad said finally, his voice cracking slightly. How long have you? 5 years, I said simply, since you told me my renewable energy dreams were unrealistic. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which I suppose they were. Mr. Dalton cleared his throat awkwardly. So, when we were discussing networking opportunities, I was thinking about the meeting I have tomorrow with 3 senators about the infrastructure bill. I finished. And when we suggested informational interviews with energy executives, Dr. Whitman trailed off. Most of them work for companies that license my technology, I said gently. Mr. Alvarez looked down at his phone again, then back at me, shaking his head slowly. We've been giving career advice to someone who just signed the biggest renewable energy contract in American history. It appears so, I said. Dad was still staring at me, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The same daughter he'd introduced as still figuring things out was apparently figuring out the future of American energy policy. The silence stretched until Mr. Dalton finally spoke. Well, he said, his voice carefully controlled. This is unexpected. Why didn't you tell me? Dad's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. His golf club lay forgotten at his feet, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part devastation, part awe, part something that might have been grief. Tell you what, exactly. I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. That I started a company. I did tell you that 5 years ago. But this, he gestured helplessly at Mr. Alvarez's phone, where my face still smiled back from the CNBC article. This is billions of dollars, government contracts, the President's Advisory Committee. Yes, I said simply, it is. Mr. Dalton cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should give you 2 some privacy. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. Please stay. You've all been so generous with your career advice today. I'd hate for you to miss the conclusion. Dad's face flushed red. Rachel, please. Please what? I turned to face him fully, and 20 years of carefully controlled resentment began to spill over. Please pretend this is a normal family misunderstanding. Please act like you didn't spend the entire morning explaining to your friends how your disappointment of a daughter needs help finding suitable employment. I was trying to help. You were trying to manage your embarrassment. The words came out cold and precise. Do you have any idea what it's like to sit here and listen to career advice from people whose companies are actively seeking partnerships with mine? To have my own father suggest I should start small and build credibility when I'm literally reshaping federal energy policy. Dr. Whitman shifted uncomfortably. Rachel, Perhaps your father simply didn't understand. He didn't understand because he never asked. I kept my eyes locked on Dad's. When I tried to tell you about Helios 5 years ago, you laughed. You said it was idealistic nonsense and that I needed to get serious about a real career. So I got serious. I built something real, and I stopped trying to share it with someone who had already decided it wasn't worth his attention. But if I had known Dad started, if you had known that it would be successful, that it would make money, that important people would take it seriously. I shook my head. The only thing that's changed is the number in my bank account. The work, the vision, the dedication that was all there 5 years ago when you dismissed it. Mr. Alvarez was still staring at his phone screen. It says here you testified before Congress about renewable energy infrastructure. When was that? Last month, I replied without breaking eye contact with Dad. The same week you told Mrs. Patterson from next door that I was still exploring my options. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear a lawnmower in the distance, could hear the rustle of wind through the trees lining the fairway, could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I don't understand, Dad said finally, his voice barely audible. Why would you hide this from me? Why would you let you think that I was a failure? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I didn't let you think anything. Dad, you decided that all on your own. I just stopped trying to convince you otherwise. But we're family. Are we? The question hung in the air like a challenge, because family members usually show some interest in each other's lives. Family members ask questions and listen to answers. Family members don't automatically assume the worst and then broadcast those assumptions to their social circle. Mr. Dalton stepped forward slightly. Rachel, I think what your father is trying to say. I know exactly what he's trying to say. I turned to address all three of them. He's trying to say that if he had known I was successful, he would have treated me differently. If he had known I was important, he would have respected me. If he had known I was valuable, he would have valued me. Dad flinched as if I'd struck him. But here's the thing, I continued, my voice gaining strength. I was valuable 5 years ago when I had the idea. I was important 3 years ago when I landed my first major client. I was successful 2 years ago when we went international. The only thing that's different today is that other people are finally talking about it loudly enough for you to hear. Rachel, Dad's voice cracked. For 5 years, I've watched you introduce me as your daughter who's still figuring things out. I've listened to you apologize for my choices to your friends. I've sat through dinner after dinner where you've expressed concern about my unrealistic expectations and my lack of direction. And through it all, I was building something that would fundamentally change how this country powers itself. The words were pouring out now, 5 years of hurt and frustration and disappointment spilling over like water from a broken dam. Do you know what the hardest part was? I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. It wasn't the 18-hour days or the rejection from investors or the technical challenges. It was coming home for Christmas and having my own father look at me with pity. It was watching you struggle to find something positive to say about my life to your friends. It was realizing that the person who was supposed to believe in me most had written me off completely. Dad's hands were shaking now, his face pale beneath his golf tan. I built a billion-dollar company, I said quietly. And I never told you about it because I finally learned what you've been trying to teach me my whole life, that your love has conditions, and your respect has a price tag. The memories came flooding back like a dam breaking, each one sharp and painful and perfectly preserved. I was 8 years old, standing in our living room with a science fair trophy, beaming with pride as I explained how my solar oven project worked. That's nice, sweetheart, Dad had said without looking up from his legal briefs. But maybe next time try something more practical. I was 16, rushing home with my acceptance letter to MIT's summer program for gifted students. MIT? He'd frowned. That's quite far from home. Are you sure you wouldn't be happier at a local program? Something more manageable. I was 22, calling from Boston to tell him about my graduate school acceptance, my voice breathless with excitement. Energy economics. His tone had been careful, diplomatic. Well, it's certainly specialized. Just make sure you have a backup plan. Rachel, academic fields can be very competitive. Every achievement, every milestone, every moment of triumph, all of them filtered through his lens of protective pessimism, all of them diminished by his need to manage expectations. His expectations, not mine. I remember when I got my first client, I said softly, the words coming from some deep well of pain I'd kept carefully sealed. 3 years ago, a municipal energy district in Oregon. They wanted to implement my grid optimization technology across their entire network. I was so excited I could barely sleep. Dad's face was gray now, his hands clasped tightly in front of him like he was trying to hold himself together. I called you at 8:30 that night to tell you. Do you remember what you said? He shook his head mutely. You said, "That's wonderful, honey. Just make sure you read the contract carefully. These small clients sometimes have unrealistic expectations." I laughed bitterly. That small client became my proof of concept. They saved 40% on their energy costs in the first year. That contract led to 12 more municipal contracts, which led to state-level interest, which led to federal recognition. Mr. Dalton shifted uncomfortably, but I was beyond caring about his discomfort. This was 28 years of silence finally breaking open. Or when I hired my first employees, I continued. Remember that conversation I was so proud I'd grown from a one-person operation to a team of 5 brilliant engineers and economists? You know what you said? Dad's voice was barely a whisper. Rachel, please. You said, just be careful about expanding too quickly. Small businesses fail when they take on too much overhead. You turned my first real milestone into a warning about failure. The golf course stretched around us, perfectly manicured and silent except for the sound of my voice carrying across the green. Dad's friends stood frozen, witnesses to the complete destruction of everything they'd thought they knew about Richard Monroe and his disappointing daughter. Every time I tried to share something with you, you found a way to diminish it. Every success became a caution. Every achievement became a concern. Every dream became a worry about my unrealistic expectations. I could see him now as he truly was not the confident attorney who commanded respect in courtrooms, but a father who had been so afraid of his daughter's failures that he'd systematically discouraged her successes. Do you know what I learned about myself these past 5 years? I asked. I learned that I'm brilliant. I learned that I'm innovative. I learned that I'm capable of changing the world in measurable, meaningful ways. And do you know how I learned that? Dad's eyes were glistening now. I learned it from strangers, from investors who saw my potential, from engineers who believed in my vision, from government officials who trusted my expertise, from competitors who respected my innovations enough to try to steal them. My voice broke slightly on the last words, and I took a breath to steady myself. I learned that I was exceptional from everyone except the one person whose opinion I'd always wanted most. The silence that followed was complete. Even the wind had stopped, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I spent my whole childhood trying to impress you, I whispered. My whole adolescence trying to make you proud. My whole adult life trying to earn your respect. And I finally realized something: you were never going to give me any of those things, because giving them to me would have meant admitting you'd been wrong about me from the beginning. Dad opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. I was trying to protect you. From what? From success, from achievement, from believing in myself. From disappointment, he said, the words barely audible. From the kind of crushing failure that destroys people. I've seen it happen. Rachel, I've seen brilliant people chase impossible dreams and lose everything. So you decided to crush me yourself? I asked, to save me from the possibility of disappointment by guaranteeing it. The accusation hung in the air between us, brutal and undeniable. I never meant, he started. You never meant to what? To make me feel like nothing I did would ever be good enough to train me to expect your disapproval so thoroughly that I stopped trying to earn your approval. I shook my head. Well, congratulations. Dad, you succeeded. I stopped believing that your opinion mattered. And there it was, the truth that had taken me 36 years to understand. I hadn't hidden my success from him to punish him. I'd hidden it to protect myself from the inevitable moment when he'd find a way to make my greatest achievement feel like just another disappointment waiting to happen. But now, standing here on the 9th tee of Meadowbrook Country Club with $4.8 billion in government contracts bearing my name, I realized something else. I didn't need his protection anymore, and I definitely didn't need his approval. What I needed was for him to finally understand the full cost of the choices he'd made. I turned to face Dad's 3 friends, who had been standing in uncomfortable silence, witnesses to the complete unraveling of everything they thought they knew. The time for protecting anyone's feelings, including my own, had passed. "Mr. Dalton," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Thank you for that excellent advice about networking. It's fascinating that you mentioned it, actually, because next week I'm having lunch with the Secretary of Commerce to discuss how my company's technology could help revitalize American manufacturing. Should I mention your steel operations? I'm sure she'd be interested in companies that are adapting to new environmental standards." Mr. Dalton's face went pale. His steel empire had been hemorrhaging contracts to more environmentally conscious competitors, and we both knew it. "Dr. Whitman," I continued, turning to the cardiac surgeon who had suggested I consider administrative roles, "your advice about starting with entry-level positions was particularly thoughtful. It reminds me of the conversation I had last month with the head of the National Institutes of Health about medical applications for clean energy technology. We discussed how hospitals could reduce their carbon footprint while cutting energy costs. Your hospital system came up, actually as an example of institutions that haven't yet embraced sustainable energy solutions." Dr. Whitman shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the implicit threat in my words. "And Mr. Alvarez," I said, fixing my gaze on the real estate mogul who had lectured me about LinkedIn optimization, "your suggestion about improving my online presence was inspired. It's funny I keep my LinkedIn profile private specifically because I can't walk through a commercial district anywhere in the country without seeing buildings that use my energy systems. Your Miami properties, for instance. I believe 3 of your newest developments are powered by Helios technology, though I'm sure you weren't aware of that when you signed the contracts." The color drained from Mr. Alvarez's face as he realized that the woman he'd been patronizing controlled technology that literally powered his business empire. "You see, gentlemen," I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word, "while you were concerned about my ability to find suitable employment, I was creating employment. While you worried about my lack of professional connections, I was building relationships with some of the most powerful people in government and industry. While you discussed whether I understood how to present myself professionally, I was representing American interests at international energy summits." Dad stood frozen beside me, watching his carefully constructed social world collapse in real time. "The truly beautiful irony," I said, warming to my theme, "is that each of you has benefited from my work without knowing it. Mr. Dalton, the federal infrastructure bill that's throwing your industry a lifeline, I helped write the energy provisions. Dr. Whitman, the new hospital efficiency standards that are saving your institution millions in operating costs. Those came out of research my team conducted. Mr. Alvarez, the tax incentives for sustainable commercial development that have made your latest projects so profitable, I testified before the Senate committee that crafted that legislation." The silence was deafening. These 3 titans of Cleveland society men who had spent the morning dispensing career advice to someone they saw as Richard Monroe's unfortunate daughter were slowly realizing they had been condescending to someone who wielded more real power than all of them combined. "But please," I continued, my voice dripping with false sweetness, "don't let me stop you from offering more guidance. I'm sure your insights about finding the right fit and building credibility could be valuable to someone who only has 17 patents, a $4.8 billion government contract, and a seat on the President's Advisory Committee. Mr. Dalton cleared his throat weakly.
Rachel, we had no idea.
Of course you had no idea, I cut him off. Because you never asked? You looked at me and saw what you expected to see Richard Monroe's underachieving daughter who needed your help and guidance. It never occurred to any of you that the quiet woman listening to your advice might actually know more about business, economics, and policy than you do. I turned back to Dad, who looked like he might collapse. And you, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more force than shouting. You taught them to see me that way. Every introduction, every explanation, every apologetic comment about my choices, you trained your friends to pity me. You were so embarrassed by having a daughter who didn't fit your definition of success that you turned me into a cautionary tale before I even had a chance to prove myself. Dad's mouth moved wordlessly, like a fish gasping for air. Do you want to know the most pathetic part? I asked. I could have told you everything. 5 years ago, 3 years ago, last year, last month. I could have shared my successes with you. I could have made you proud. I could have let you brag about your daughter the way other fathers brag about their children. My voice cracked slightly, and I paused to regain control. But I was so tired of being disappointed by your reaction that I chose to protect myself instead of giving you another chance to diminish my achievements. I chose silence over the risk of watching you find fault with the best thing I'd ever done. The golf course stretched endlessly around us, a perfect green expanse that suddenly felt like a stage for the complete destruction of a relationship that had been broken for far longer than either of us had been willing to admit. So, congratulations, Dad, I said finally. You succeeded in protecting me from disappointment. You protected me so thoroughly that I learned to expect nothing from you at all. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had taken 36 years to fully open. Dad stood there, his golf club forgotten at his feet, his face a mask of devastation and dawning comprehension. His 3 friends had become statues, frozen witnesses to the complete inversion of everything they thought they knew about power, success, and the quiet woman they'd spent the morning pitying. Rachel, Dad whispered finally, his voice broken. I don't know what to say. There's nothing to say, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. This isn't a conversation. Dad, this is a reckoning. I looked around the golf course one last time, the pristine fairways where I'd spent so many childhood afternoons feeling like an outsider in my own family's world. The clubhouse where Dad had introduced me as his disappointment to anyone who would listen. The green where 3 powerful men had just learned that the woman they'd been condescending to controlled more wealth and influence than they could imagine. Gentlemen, I said, addressing Mr. Dalton, Dr. Whitman, and Mr. Alvarez with cold politeness. It's been illuminating. Mr. Dalton, when your lawyers call my legal team about environmental compliance issues, please remember this conversation. Dr. Whitman, when your hospital board discusses their energy efficiency initiatives, know that you're implementing my recommendations. Mr. Alvarez, when you sign your next sustainable development contract, understand that you're licensing my technology. I paused, letting that sink in. And the next time you're tempted to offer career advice to someone you've just met, you might want to consider the possibility that they already know more about their industry than you do. The 3 men stood in stunned silence, their comfortable worldview shattered beyond repair. I turned back to Dad, who looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical stature. You spent my entire life worried that I would embarrass you, I said quietly, that I would fail publicly and reflect poorly on the Monroe name, that I would make choices that would make you look bad to your friends. Dad's eyes were glistening with unshed tears. But it was never my failures you had to worry about, was it? I continued. It was my successes. because every achievement I earned without your approval, every milestone I reached despite your discouragement, every dream I made real after you called it impossible, all of that was proof that your judgment was wrong. I picked up my purse from the golf cart, my movements deliberate and final. You didn't want to protect me from disappointment, Dad. You wanted to protect yourself from being proven wrong about your own daughter. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the manicured grass. In the distance, other golfers continued their games, oblivious to the fact that one of the most powerful people in American energy policy had just ended a relationship that had been dying by degrees for decades. Rachel, please! Dad reached out as if to stop me from leaving. Please, what? I asked, not turning around. Please pretend this didn't happen. Please go back to letting you introduce me as your failure while I secretly run a billion-dollar company. Please give you another chance to find fault with the best thing I've ever accomplished. I shook my head. I'm done protecting your feelings at the expense of my own dignity. I'm done making myself smaller so you can feel better about being my father. And I'm done pretending that your approval matters more than my own self-respect. I started walking toward the parking lot, my heels clicking against the cart path with a finality that seemed to echo across the entire golf course. Rachel, Dad called after me, his voice cracking with desperation. Don't leave like this. I stopped and turned around one last time. He stood there surrounded by his friends, looking lost and confused and utterly defeated, a man who had just realized that his greatest failure wasn't his daughter's lack of success, but his own inability to recognize her extraordinary achievements. Hi, you know what the saddest part is, I called back. I would have shared all of this with you, every patent, every contract, every milestone. I would have made you the proudest father in Cleveland. All you had to do was believe in me just once. I looked at him for a long moment, memorizing the face of the man who had shaped so much of my life through his relentless disappointment. But you couldn't even do that. The walk to my car felt like crossing a bridge that was burning behind me. I didn't look back as I drove away from Meadowbrook Country Club, leaving my father and his friends to contemplate the wreckage of their assumptions. By noon, the news of my contract would be trending on financial networks. By evening, every major business publication would be running profiles of the mysterious energy mogul who had seemingly appeared from nowhere. By tomorrow, Richard Monroe would wake up to a world where everyone knew that his disappointment of a daughter was actually one of the most influential people in American energy policy. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care what he thought about it. The revenge was complete, but as I drove home through the streets of Cleveland, I realized something unexpected. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like freedom. Thank you for listening to this story of family expectations, hidden success, and the ultimate reckoning. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story right now? Are you commuting, taking a break at work, or settling in for the evening? Please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something similar with family members who underestimated you? Let's connect and discuss these complex family dynamics together.